So the other day there and today I made videos about how the government plans to basically make misogyny a crime. If you haven't seen those videos or seen anything like that about this, basically if a man makes misogynistic comments or talks to someone in a misogynistic way, they'll be treated like a crime, like a hate crime. I think one news outlet mentioned terrorism.
There are moments in history when people do not realize a line has been crossed until they are already standing far beyond it. What begins as a push for fairness quietly mutates into something far more rigid, far more controlling, and far less humane. Today, we are going to talk about a set of ideas and policies that are being presented as progress, but may actually be laying the groundwork for a society where basic human interaction becomes a risk. Stay with me to the very end of this video, because what we are discussing is not just about laws or politics. It is about how people will choose to live, speak, and withdraw from one another in the years ahead. Before we go any further, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this perspective, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. That support matters more than you realize, and it helps keep these conversations visible. Also, if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth in an increasingly unstable world, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy. Inside the Academy, I break down how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to think long-term, and how to avoid common traps that catch people off guard. The link is in the description of this video, so go check it out now while you're thinking about it. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show direct support for the work that goes into them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to keep the lights on and the content coming. Now let's get into it. Across parts of the Western world, and particularly in the UK, we are seeing a shift in how speech between men and women is being discussed, regulated, and in some cases formally scrutinized. Policies that once focused on clear cases of harassment or abuse are expanding into far more subjective territory. The language being used is intentionally vague. Terms like offensive, inappropriate, or harmful are no longer tied to specific actions, but instead to perception, interpretation, and emotional response. This matters because when rules are built on subjective interpretation rather than clear behavior, the outcome is always uncertainty. Recent discussions and proposals in UK politics, including internal party rules and broader legislative conversations, have signaled that men correcting women in disagreements, interrupting them, or speaking in a way that is interpreted as dismissive could lead to disciplinary action or formal consequences in certain institutional settings. This is being framed as a necessary correction to historical imbalances. But the real question is not what the intention is. The real question is what happens when these ideas move from controlled environments into everyday life, workplaces, and public interaction. History tells us that when speech becomes risky, people do not become more thoughtful, they become silent, they withdraw, they avoid, and this is where the unintended consequences begin to surface. One of the most dangerous assumptions being made right now is that communication can be cleanly regulated without fundamentally altering human behavior. Human interaction is not a checklist. It is tone, timing, context, body language, and mutual understanding. When people are told that their words may be judged not just by what they say, but by how someone else feels about it later, the rational response is not better communication. The rational response is distance. For many men, that distance has already begun to form. For decades, men have been told directly and indirectly that their presence is not required, that their instincts are flawed, and that their natural ways of communicating are inherently suspect. Masculinity itself has been repeatedly framed as something that must be corrected, softened, or restrained. When people hear that message long enough, they adapt. And adaptation does not always look like reform. Sometimes it looks like retreat. And this is where the concept of men walking away begins to make sense. Not as a dramatic protest, not as an organized movement, but as millions of individual decisions made quietly. Decisions to stop engaging where the cost of engagement feels unpredictable and one sided. Decisions to limit exposure to situations where intent does not protect you from interpretation. What we are witnessing is not men becoming hostile, it is men becoming selective. When speech rules become unclear, power shifts to the interpreter. And when power shifts to the interpreter, conversation becomes a liability. In professional environments, this creates immediate consequences. Employers, managers, and business owners do not operate on ideology, they operate on risk assessment. If one category of interaction carries a higher compliance burden, higher documentation requirements, and higher potential for conflict, that category becomes something to minimize. This is not about personal beliefs. It is about incentives. If companies believe that interactions between male and female employees require increased monitoring, training, reporting, and intervention, they will not address this with philosophical debates. They will address it structurally. That may mean fewer mixed teams, fewer one-on-one meetings, less mentorship across genders, and in some cases, avoidance altogether. This outcome is rarely discussed openly, but it is already happening in subtle ways. Closed door meetings become open door meetings. Informal conversations disappear. Opportunities that once emerged through casual professional rapport are now filtered through formal systems. The human element is slowly being replaced by procedure. Supporters of these policies often argue that this is a necessary price to pay for safety and respect. But safety that removes trust is not safety, it is surveillance. When every interaction must be filtered through the possibility of review, recording, or reinterpretation, authenticity dies. And when authenticity dies, relationships follow. Outside the workplace, the effects are even more visible. Men are already reporting that they avoid casual conversation with women in public spaces, not out of resentment, but out of caution. A comment that once would have been neutral is now weighed for potential misunderstanding. Silence becomes the safer option. Over time, this silence reshapes social norms. People stop practicing communication. They stop learning how to disagree respectfully. They stop developing resilience to differing perspectives. Instead of dialogue, you get parallel existences. This is not progress, it is fragmentation. What makes the situation especially ironic is that many of the same voices advocating for stricter speech regulation are also expressing concern about loneliness, social isolation, and declining relationships. These outcomes are not separate issues. They are connected by cause and effect. You cannot tell one group of people that their participation is dangerous, while simultaneously asking them to engage more. Men, particularly younger men, are responding exactly as systems theory would predict. They are optimizing for peace. They are simplifying their lives. They are removing variables that introduce stress without offering meaningful reward. For many men, solitude has stopped being framed as failure and has instead become stability. This does not mean men are incapable of connection. It means they are becoming more intentional about where and how they invest energy. When interaction feels transactional, adversarial, or risky, the cost benefit analysis shifts. And this is where the broader cultural misunderstanding becomes obvious. Many women celebrating stricter rules around male speech believe this will create better behavior. What it actually creates is absence. Men do not become quieter versions of themselves. They step back entirely. Over time, this absence becomes structural. Dating declines, marriage rates fall, birth rates follow, informal social networks weaken. And the same institutions that encouraged disengagement begin to panic when they realize the social fabric is thinning. We are already seeing early signs of this panic. Online discourse is filled with concern about declining dating participation, rising loneliness, and economic strain on single households. These trends are not occurring in isolation. They are downstream effects of years of messaging that framed men as problems to be managed rather than participants to be valued. There is a fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of this issue. Respect cannot be legislated into existence through fear of punishment. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Respect emerges from mutual recognition, shared responsibility, and clear boundaries that apply equally. When rules apply unevenly, trust erodes. Another often ignored consequence is how these dynamics affect political and institutional communication. If direct engagement becomes fraught, decision making consolidates, conversations become internal, perspectives narrow, and representation becomes symbolic rather than functional. This leads to a form of soft segregation, not enforced by law but by habit. People speak only where they feel safe. Groups retreat into ideological echo chambers, and compromise becomes increasingly rare. At the same time, surveillance expands. Policies that require monitoring of communication do not remain confined to extreme cases. They scale. Digital tools are introduced, training programs multiply, reporting mechanisms expand, and soon, normal human friction is treated as a compliance issue. This is exhausting for institutions and individuals alike. And when systems become exhausting, people disengage. Men who have disengaged often describe an unexpected outcome: peace. Not because life is perfect, but because the constant tension of expectation is gone. They focus on work, hobbies, health, and financial independence. They simplify. They choose quiet over conflict. This shift is often misunderstood as bitterness. In reality, it is boundary setting. For decades, men were told to adapt. Many did. They listened, they adjusted language, they stepped back. And now, faced with ever shifting standards and increasing penalties for missteps, many have concluded that further engagement offers diminishing returns. This is not a threat, it is an observation. The narrative that men must be corrected at every turn eventually produces men who opt out of the conversation entirely. And when that happens, the social consequences are not evenly distributed. As economic pressures increase and support systems weaken, the absence of male participation becomes more visible. The same society that encouraged withdrawal begins to ask why engagement has declined. But by then, the habits are formed. People do not re enter systems that taught them they were not welcome. They build alternatives. This is where the concept of men walking away becomes more than a slogan. It becomes a description of a pattern. Men choosing self preservation over social validation, choosing clarity over chaos, choosing solitude over constant scrutiny. None of this had to happen this way. A culture that encouraged mutual accountability and clear standards could have strengthened relationships rather than hollowing them out. But when dialogue is replaced with discipline, the result is predictable. As we move forward, the question is not whether these policies will have consequences, they already do. The real question is whether society is prepared to acknowledge those consequences honestly. To understand where this is heading, you have to look at how incentives shape behavior over time. Societies are not guided by slogans, they are guided by consequences. When a system consistently rewards withdrawal and penalizes engagement, people do not debate morality, they adapt. That adaptation becomes culture, and culture becomes destiny. One of the most overlooked aspects of the shift is how quickly informal social correction disappears once formal enforcement takes over. In healthy societies, people learn boundaries through feedback. Someone says something awkward, it is corrected socially, and life moves on. This process builds resilience, empathy, and emotional intelligence on both sides. When that process is replaced by institutional discipline, learning stops. Fear replaces growth. When men are told that a disagreement itself can be interpreted as disrespect, the safest move is not to disagree at all. Over time, this eliminates a crucial function of dialogue. Disagreement is how ideas are refined, it is how errors are corrected, it is how truth emerges through friction. Remove that friction, and what you are left with is surface harmony and internal decay. This is especially dangerous in professional and political environments where decisions affect millions. If certain voices hesitate to speak openly, decisions become skewed, not because of malice, but because of absence. Silence does not mean agreement, it means risk avoidance. In the long run, this creates brittle systems, systems that appear calm until they suddenly fail. Another layer to this issue is how language itself is being redefined. Words that once had clear meanings are now treated as emotional containers. Intent is dismissed, context is minimized, impact becomes the only metric that matters. But impact is subjective, it changes based on mood, memory, and social conditioning. When rules are built on subjective impact alone, they become impossible to navigate consistently. People cannot predict outcomes. And when people cannot predict outcomes, they disengage. This is why you see men retreating not just from dating, but from mentorship, leadership roles, and even public participation. The cost of being misunderstood has risen, while the reward for engagement has diminished. This does not create equality, it creates parallel realities. Supporters of these trends often argue that those who withdraw are revealing their character, but that interpretation ignores human nature. People avoid environments where the rules feel unstable. That is not weakness, that is pattern recognition. Men in particular tend to respond to unclear social rules by simplifying, remove variables, reduce exposure, focus on controllable outcomes. This is not ideology, it is strategy. Over time, this strategy reshapes demographics. Fewer men pursue relationships. Fewer men pursue marriage. Fewer men invest emotionally in institutions that appear adversarial. Instead, they invest in themselves. This shift is already measurable. Participation in dating apps has declined. Marriage rates continue to fall. Birth rates are dropping across developed nations. These are not moral judgments, they are data points. And yet, the response from policymakers and cultural leaders is often confusion. Why are people disengaging? Why are young men opting out? Why is loneliness increasing? The answer is not mysterious. People are responding to incentives exactly as designed. Another unintended consequence is the erosion of trust between genders. When one group is encouraged to interpret the other as a potential threat, cooperation becomes conditional. Every interaction becomes a calculation. Over time, goodwill evaporates. Trust cannot survive constant suspicion. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply held belief that safety can be maximized without cost. Every system has trade offs. When emotional safety is pursued through control rather than connection, relational safety suffers. This is not an argument against accountability, it is an argument against ambiguity. Clear rules protect everyone. Vague rules empower whoever controls interpretation. and interpretation always flows toward power. This is why these policies disproportionately affect men who are conscientious rather than malicious. Those with harmful intent do not self regulate. Those who care about consequences do. And when conscientious people withdraw, the system becomes less safe, not more. Another critical factor is how these dynamics affect younger generations. Boys and young men are absorbing these messages early. They are learning that speaking carries risk, that disagreement is dangerous, that silence is safer. This shapes identity. Instead of developing confidence through trial and error, many are developing caution through avoidance. They are not becoming better communicators, they are becoming quieter observers. This has long term consequences for leadership, innovation, and social cohesion. Societies need people willing to speak, challenge, and engage. When that willingness is punished, stagnation follows. At the same time, women are being told that institutional protection will solve interpersonal dissatisfaction, that if rules are strict enough, outcomes will improve. But rules cannot replace attraction, policies cannot manufacture desire, and enforcement cannot substitute for mutual interest. This disconnect is becoming increasingly visible online. Expressions of frustration coexist with demands for engagement, but engagement cannot be compelled, it must be invited. Men who have walked away often describe a moment of clarity, a realization that peace does not require validation, that fulfillment does not require constant negotiation, that self respect sometimes means stepping back rather than leaning in. This realization is quietly spreading, and it is important to understand that this is not about anger, it is about exhaustion. Decades of mixed messages, shifting expectations, and asymmetric accountability have taken a toll. Many men are not protesting. They are resting. They are opting for simplicity in a world that has become unnecessarily complex. This simplicity looks like focusing on health, finances, hobbies, and personal goals. It looks like reducing exposure to drama. It looks like choosing environments where rules are clear and outcomes are predictable. From the outside, this can look like disengagement. From the inside, it feels like relief. Another overlooked aspect is how technology amplifies these dynamics. Online platforms reward outrage. Misunderstandings spread faster than clarifications. Context is stripped away. Intent is assumed. This creates a permanent record of momentary interactions. A comment taken out of context can follow someone indefinitely. This raises the stakes of participation even further. In this environment, withdrawal becomes rational. At the same time, institutions are struggling to manage the volume of reporting and oversight required by these new norms. Training programs expand, compliance departments grow. Yet satisfaction does not increase proportionally. This is because the root issue is not regulation, it is relationship. When people feel seen as individuals rather than categories, behavior improves naturally. When people feel categorized and monitored, they retreat. This applies to every social system in history. There is also a deeper philosophical issue at play. Many of these policies assume that conflict is inherently harmful, but conflict, when managed respectfully, is how understanding grows. Removing conflict does not create harmony, it creates suppression. Suppression always leaks. It leaks through resentment, disengagement, and eventual backlash. Not always loud, often quiet. Men walking away is not a rebellion, it is a release valve. And once people experience life without constant social friction, they rarely rush back. This creates a feedback loop. As men disengage, remaining interactions become more strained. As strain increases, rules tighten. As rules tighten, disengagement accelerates. Breaking this loop requires humility. It requires acknowledging that good intentions can produce harmful outcomes. It requires recalibrating toward mutual responsibility rather than unilateral control. So far, that recalibration has not happened. Instead, narratives harden, blame replaces reflection, and the gap widens. The tragedy here is that most people want the same things: respect, safety, meaningful connection, but the path chosen to achieve those goals matters. You cannot build trust through fear. You cannot create closeness through coercion. And you cannot sustain a society by pushing half its population into silence. As economic pressures increase and social safety nets strain, the absence of cooperation becomes more costly. Households struggle, communities weaken, institutions lose legitimacy. And still, the assumption persists that more rules will fix what fewer relationships cannot. At some point, reality intervenes. People vote with their feet, with their attention, with their absence. And men who have walked away are not waiting to be persuaded. They have already adapted. They have built routines that do not rely on approval or negotiation. For many, this is the first time they have felt genuinely at ease. That is not something easily reversed. To understand how deep these changes run, you have to examine how economics responds to social behavior, not to ideals. Markets, labor forces, and institutions react to incentives faster than culture does. When social dynamics change, economic patterns follow, whether policymakers acknowledge them or not. One of the earliest signals appears in household formation. When fewer men choose long term partnerships, the structure of consumption shifts. Dual income households decline. Risk pooling disappears. Expenses that were once shared become individual burdens. Housing costs rise not only because of market forces, but because fewer people are willing to cohabitate under conditions they perceive as unstable or adversarial. This has consequences that extend far beyond dating culture. It affects housing demand, urban planning, and even credit markets. Single person households require more units, more infrastructure, and more energy per capita. Costs rise across the board. And those costs land hardest on people who rely on shared economic stability to survive. At the same time, men who opt out of traditional family structures often become more financially conservative. They save more. They spend less on status signaling. They invest in assets rather than appearances. This shifts entire consumer categories. Industries built around romance, weddings, and lifestyle branding feel the impact first, but the ripple spreads. Another critical area is labor participation. When social environments feel hostile or unpredictable, people disengage emotionally from work as well. They do the minimum required. They avoid leadership roles that require interpersonal navigation under unclear rules. They decline mentorship opportunities. Over time, organizations lose institutional knowledge and continuity. This is not speculation. It is a known effect in organizational psychology. When perceived risk exceeds perceived reward, discretionary effort collapses. What makes the current moment unique is that this disengagement is happening alongside increasing demands for emotional labor. People are expected to constantly self monitor, self edit, and anticipate interpretation. This creates cognitive load. Cognitive load reduces performance. High performers notice this quickly. They simplify, they isolate, they choose roles with minimal exposure, or they leave entirely. This is how talent drains begin quietly. Meanwhile, institutions respond by creating more rules, more oversight, more training. But none of this addresses the core issue. You cannot regulate trust into existence. Another economic effect appears in entrepreneurship. Historically, men have taken disproportionate risks in starting businesses, not because of ideology, but because of risk tolerance. When social and reputational risk rises alongside financial risk, fewer people step forward. Entrepreneurship requires the freedom to fail publicly. It requires disagreement. It requires confidence in one's judgment, even when others object. When those traits are framed as problematic, innovation slows. This is not a moral statement. it is a structural one. As entrepreneurship declines, consolidation increases. Large institutions with compliance departments and legal buffers dominate. Smaller players disappear. Choice narrows. Prices rise. This is how social policy quietly reshapes markets. Another area often ignored is how these dynamics affect immigration and migration. People do not just move for jobs, they move for social climate. Regions perceived as less restrictive attract talent. Regions perceived as more punitive lose it. This creates uneven development. Some areas stagnate while others thrive, and the dividing line is often cultural rather than economic. At the demographic level, declining birth rates become unavoidable. This is not because people dislike children, it is because they dislike uncertainty. Raising children requires trust, cooperation, and long term commitment. When those foundations weaken, people delay or opt out. Governments respond with incentives, tax credits, subsidies, campaigns encouraging participation. But incentives cannot overcome fear. People do not build families in environments they perceive as unstable. This leads to an aging population. Fewer workers support more dependents. Pension systems strain. Healthcare costs rise. And the pressure intensifies. Ironically, the same policies intended to protect future generations may end up leaving them with fewer resources and less support. Another long-term consequence is political polarization. When direct communication breaks down, people retreat into homogeneous groups. Dialogue across differences diminishes. Compromise becomes rare. Policy swings become extreme. This volatility discourages investment. Long-term planning becomes difficult. Stability erodes. All of this feeds back into individual behavior. People become more cautious, more insular, more focused on personal survival than collective growth. This is not because people are selfish, it is because systems reward self-protection. At the cultural level, storytelling changes, narratives shift from collaboration to caution, from building together to protecting oneself. Media reflects and reinforces this shift. Young men growing up in this environment internalize these lessons early. They learn to observe rather than participate, to analyze rather than engage, to wait rather than act. This produces a generation that is highly aware but deeply hesitant. At the same time, women are often encouraged to externalize dissatisfaction, to view institutions as solutions to interpersonal challenges. But institutions are blunt tools. They cannot create chemistry, they cannot mandate connection. This mismatch between expectation and outcome leads to frustration on all sides. Online platforms amplify this frustration. Algorithms reward emotional intensity. Nuance disappears. People are reduced to avatars and labels. Misunderstanding becomes entertainment. In such an environment, opting out is not a failure, it is a defense mechanism. Men who have opted out often report improved mental clarity, reduced anxiety, greater focus. This is not because they dislike people, it is because they removed sources of constant evaluation. This raises an uncomfortable question. If peace is found in withdrawal, what does that say about the systems people are withdrawing from? The answer is not that society is irredeemable. It is that incentives matter more than intentions. When people are told they are valued but treated as liabilities, they believe the treatment. When people are told to engage but punished for missteps, they disengage. When people are told to be authentic but monitored constantly, they perform less and retreat more. This pattern repeats across history. Another often ignored factor is how these dynamics affect conflict resolution. When disagreement is discouraged, resentment accumulates. Without release, tension builds. This does not lead to harmony. It leads to sudden breakdowns. Healthy systems allow controlled disagreement. They provide off-ramps. They normalize friction. Removing friction entirely is impossible. Suppressing it simply moves it underground. At a certain point, suppressed systems fail abruptly. This is why the current trajectory is so concerning, not because of any single policy, but because of cumulative effects. Each rule adds weight, each ambiguity adds stress, each withdrawal removes a stabilizing presence. Eventually, the structure cannot support itself. The solution is not to reverse accountability, it is to restore balance, to create standards that are clear, consistent, and applied equally. To recognize that adults need space to navigate differences without constant oversight. To accept that discomfort is part of growth. So far, this recognition has been slow. Instead, debates remain ideological rather than practical. Critics are dismissed rather than engaged. Warnings are framed as resistance rather than foresight. But reality does not respond to labels, it responds to incentives. Men walking away is not an ideology, it is a response, and responses persist until conditions change. As economic strain increases and social systems weaken, the absence of male participation will become more visible, not because men are superior, but because their withdrawal leaves gaps. Gaps in labor, gaps in mentorship, gaps in protection, gaps in innovation. These gaps will not be filled by rules. They will only be filled by trust. And trust cannot be commanded. When large scale social shifts take hold, they do not announce themselves with alarms, they show up quietly in daily routines, in how people sit, in how they speak, in how long eye contact lasts or does not, in who initiates conversation and who decides it is safer not to. Public spaces are often the first places where these changes become visible. Cafes, gyms, offices, public transport, shops, places where people once exchanged small talk now feel noticeably quieter. Interactions become transactional and brief. Politeness replaces warmth. Distance replaces curiosity. This is not accidental, it is learned behavior. When people internalize the idea that interaction carries risk, they reduce exposure, they limit expression, they follow scripts, they avoid ambiguity. Over time, this becomes normal. Men, in particular, have adapted to this environment by becoming increasingly invisible in shared spaces. Not confrontational, not disruptive, simply absent, headphones on, eyes forward, minimal engagement. This behavior is often misinterpreted as coldness or disinterest. In reality, it is self regulation. When every interaction is potentially evaluated, neutrality feels safest. This shift affects not only social life, but community life. Informal networks weaken, casual mentorship disappears, intergenerational connection fades. People become isolated not because they lack opportunity, but because opportunity feels unsafe. This has profound effects on mental health across society. Humans are social by nature, but social interaction requires trust. When trust is replaced by monitoring, the psychological cost increases. Men who disengage often report a paradox: less social contact, but more peace. Fewer interactions, but less stress. This is not because isolation is ideal, it is because constant vigilance is exhausting. Over time, the nervous system adapts. People stop seeking connection that feels conditional. They invest in solitude that feels stable. This creates a cultural blind spot. Policymakers and commentators often assume disengagement is temporary, that people will return once conditions improve slightly. But behavioral conditioning does not reverse easily. Habits formed under pressure persist even when pressure eases. Once someone has structured their life around low exposure, re entering high exposure environments requires a compelling reason. And for many men, that reason no longer exists. This is particularly visible in dating behavior. Dating requires vulnerability, it requires risk, it requires missteps. When those missteps carry disproportionate consequences, participation drops. This is not about rejection. Rejection is manageable, uncertainty is not. As a result, dating shifts toward extremes, either highly curated online interaction or none at all. Casual, organic meeting becomes rare. The middle ground disappears. This feeds frustration on all sides. People want connection, but the pathways to connection are blocked by fear and expectation. Another everyday impact is how disagreement is handled. In healthy relationships, disagreement is a form of engagement. It signals investment. When disagreement becomes suspect, silence replaces dialogue. This leads to surface agreement and underlying resentment. Issues are not resolved, they are avoided. Avoidance becomes a skill. Over time, this erodes the ability to navigate conflict at all. People become less practiced in articulating differences, less tolerant of discomfort, more reactive when conflict inevitably arises. This makes society more fragile. Public discourse reflects this fragility. Conversations become polarized. People talk past each other rather than with each other. Nuance disappears. Complexity is flattened. This is not because people are incapable of nuance. It is because nuance requires trust. When trust declines, people retreat into simplified narratives. Another area where these changes show up is education. Young men entering academic environments are often hyper aware of speech norms. Participation drops, classroom discussion becomes uneven, certain perspectives are expressed confidently, others cautiously or not at all. Educators notice this, but often misinterpret it as apathy. In reality, it is risk management. When students learn that speaking incorrectly carries reputational cost, they learn to stay quiet. This does not produce better learning outcomes. It produces compliance. Compliance is not the same as understanding. Over time, this affects intellectual diversity. Ideas circulate within narrower bands. Critical thinking suffers. Creativity declines. The same pattern appears in corporate training environments. Programs designed to improve communication often increase anxiety instead. People focus on what not to say rather than how to say things well. This defensive posture limits growth. Another overlooked consequence is how these norms affect friendships across genders. Platonic relationships require ease. They require trust that miscommunication will be resolved, not escalated. When that trust is absent, friendships thin out. People stick to same gender circles. Social worlds shrink. This segregation is not mandated, it is emergent. And emergent patterns are harder to reverse than formal rules. As these patterns solidify, they shape expectations. Younger generations grow up assuming distance is normal. That caution is wisdom. That silence is maturity. They do not miss what they never experienced. This creates a long tail effect. Even if policies change, the cultural memory remains. Another layer to consider is how these dynamics affect caregiving and community support. Traditionally, men have played significant roles in informal support systems, helping neighbors, fixing things, providing assistance without formal structure. When engagement declines, these informal supports weaken. Communities become more dependent on formal services. Costs rise, efficiency drops. This is not about gender roles. It is about participation. Participation declines when people feel unwelcome or monitored. This also affects crisis response. In emergencies, people rely on spontaneous cooperation. Trust and initiative matter. When initiative has been conditioned out of people, response slows. These effects compound. At the same time, there is a narrative disconnect. Many public discussions frame disengagement as defiance or hostility. This framing prevents understanding. Most men who disengage are not angry, they are tired. They are not rejecting society, they are simplifying their relationship with it. This simplification often includes focusing on personal routines that provide stability, fitness, skill building, financial planning, solitary hobbies, structured environments. These choices are often framed as avoidance, but they are adaptive responses to unpredictability. The irony is that many of these men are more emotionally regulated, more self aware, and less reactive than before. They have removed triggers rather than escalating conflict. This is not the outcome envisioned by those advocating for stricter social control. Another consequence is how attraction dynamics shift. Attraction thrives on polarity, confidence, and spontaneity. Overregulation dampens all three. When people are hyper cautious, interactions become sterile. Interest fades. Chemistry disappears. This leads to a cycle where people blame each other rather than the environment. Men withdraw because interaction feels risky. Women express frustration because engagement declines. Institutions respond with more rules. The cycle continues. Breaking this cycle requires addressing root causes, not symptoms. Another daily impact is how humor disappears. Humor relies on shared context and tolerance for imperfection. When humor is policed, people stop trying. This removes a powerful social lubricant. Laughter builds bonds. Without it, interactions become purely functional. Functional interaction is efficient, but not fulfilling. This contributes to a broader sense of emptiness that many people report but struggle to explain. And they have connection but not closeness, interaction but not intimacy. Men who have opted out often compare their lives before and after disengagement. Many report that while their social circle shrank, their sense of agency increased. Agency matters. Feeling in control of one's environment reduces stress. Predictability increases confidence. These benefits are not easily surrendered. This is why attempts to shame disengagement often fail. Shame only works when people value approval. Many no longer do. They have recalibrated their values toward internal stability rather than external validation. This shift is not reversible through messaging alone. It requires structural change. That change would involve restoring clear boundaries, encouraging good faith disagreement, reducing ambiguity, treating adults as capable of navigating complexity. So far, most responses have gone in the opposite direction. Instead of trusting individuals, systems attempt to manage behavior through rules. This reduces responsibility rather than increasing it. When responsibility is outsourced, people disengage further. Another important aspect is how these dynamics affect long term partnerships for those who do form them. Relationships formed under conditions of fear tend to be brittle. Partners avoid difficult conversations. Issues fester. This increases separation rates, which further discourages others from trying. The cumulative effect is a society that appears calm but lacks resilience. Resilience comes from practice, from navigating difficulty, from repairing misunderstandings. Remove those opportunities, and resilience declines. As these patterns spread, they shape how people think about the future. Long term planning feels risky, commitment feels dangerous, flexibility becomes the priority. This affects everything from career choices to housing decisions. People delay, people hedge, people keep options open. And this is rational behavior in uncertain environments. But it also reduces collective investment. When fewer people invest deeply, systems weaken. And this is the trade off that is rarely acknowledged. You cannot maximize individual safety without sacrificing collective vitality. Balance is required. To understand why these patterns have taken hold so deeply, you have to examine the stories people are being told about themselves and each other. Societies do not move primarily through laws, they move through narratives. Laws follow culture, not the other way around. When the dominant stories shift, behavior follows long before policy catches up. For years now, media narratives have increasingly framed social dynamics in moral terms rather than practical ones. Issues that were once discussed as complex human interactions are now presented as battles between right and wrong. This framing simplifies storytelling, but it distorts reality. When people are reduced to symbols rather than individuals, empathy collapses. Men are often cast in these narratives as problems to be managed rather than participants to be understood. This does not require overt hostility. It happens through repetition, through headlines, through selective framing, through the consistent emphasis on worst case behavior while ignoring everyday normal interaction. Over time, people internalize these stories. Men learn that they are seen first as risks. Women learn that discomfort should be externalized rather than negotiated. Institutions learn that signaling moral alignment matters more than solving underlying issues. This creates a feedback loop. Media highlights conflict. Institutions respond with rules. Individuals respond with avoidance. Media then reports on disengagement as another problem to be solved. The cycle continues. One of the most damaging aspects of this narrative framing is that it removes agency from everyone involved. Men are told their behavior is determined by social conditioning rather than choice. Women are told their reactions are unavoidable rather than contextual. Both are framed as products rather than participants. This is disempowering. When people are told they are not responsible for navigating differences, they stop trying. Responsibility shifts upward to institutions. Institutions, in turn, are ill equipped to manage human nuance at scale. This is where moral language becomes a substitute for practical thinking. Words like harm, safety, and accountability are used broadly without clear definitions. These words carry emotional weight but little operational clarity. Without clarity, enforcement becomes inconsistent. Inconsistency breeds distrust. People begin to assume the worst, not because they want to, but because unpredictability demands caution. Another element shaping behavior is how public shaming has been normalized. Online platforms reward exposure. A single moment can be captured, stripped of context, and distributed widely. This creates reputational risk that far outweighs the original interaction. This risk is not evenly distributed. Those with more to lose become more cautious. Those with less to lose become more vocal. As a result, discourse skews toward extremes. Moderate voices withdraw. Nuanced perspectives disappear. What remains is a distorted reflection of reality that reinforces fear on all sides. Institutions then respond to this distorted reflection rather than lived experience. Policies are crafted based on viral narratives rather than everyday interaction. This misalignment produces rules that do not fit reality. When rules do not fit reality, people do not comply thoughtfully. They comply minimally or not at all. This is where disengagement accelerates. Another factor is the moral elevation of intent over outcome or outcome over intent, depending on convenience. In some narratives, intent is dismissed entirely. In others, impact is ignored. This inconsistency confuses people. Clear moral systems require consistency. When standards shift depending on who is speaking or who is affected, trust erodes. Men observing this inconsistency learn quickly that fairness is not guaranteed. They adapt by reducing exposure rather than arguing for change. This adaptation is often mischaracterized as apathy. In reality, it is strategic disengagement. Women observing disengagement are often told it reflects entitlement or fragility. This framing prevents introspection. Instead of asking why engagement declined, the focus shifts to moral judgment. Judgment rarely restores connection. Another narrative shaping behavior is the idea that discomfort is inherently negative. This idea is appealing, but flawed. Growth requires discomfort. Learning requires challenge. Relationships require negotiation. When discomfort is framed as damage rather than development, people avoid it at all costs. This avoidance limits maturity. Over time, societies that minimize discomfort also minimize resilience. This becomes evident when unexpected challenges arise. Without practiced resilience, systems fracture under pressure. Another subtle but powerful narrative is the idea that silence equals guilt. This narrative discourages listening. It discourages reflection. People feel compelled to respond immediately to avoid suspicion. This reactive environment increases misunderstanding. Thoughtful dialogue requires pause. When pause is punished, quality declines. Men often respond to this by choosing silence intentionally rather than reactively. This is a defensive choice. Silence becomes a shield. This further reinforces the narrative that men are disengaged or uninterested. But disengagement is not disinterest, it is self preservation. Another influence is how institutional messaging often conflates policy goals with moral virtue. Supporting a policy becomes a signal of goodness, questioning it becomes suspect. This discourages good faith critique. Without critique, policies stagnate, problems compound. Men who attempt to raise concerns about unintended consequences are often dismissed rather than engaged. This teaches others not to speak. Over time, a culture of compliance replaces a culture of dialogue. Compliance produces short term calm and long term instability. Another important narrative is the framing of power as static rather than situational. Power shifts depending on context. When power is framed as permanently belonging to one group, complexity is lost. This framing justifies one sided rules. But one sided rules breed resistance, even if that resistance is quiet. Men walking away is a form of resistance that does not announce itself. It does not protest, it does not demand, it simply opts out. This makes it easy to ignore until its effects become widespread. Media narratives often lag behind behavior. By the time disengagement is discussed seriously, habits are entrenched. Another overlooked factor is how virtue signaling replaces problem solving. Institutions often prioritize appearing responsive over being effective. Policies are introduced quickly to demonstrate action. Consequences are considered later, if at all. This reactive governance produces unstable environments. People learn not to trust long term commitments when rules change rapidly. Men respond by avoiding commitments that depend on institutional stability. This includes not only relationships, but careers, locations, and community involvement. Flexibility becomes the highest value. Flexibility reduces vulnerability, but it also reduces investment. When fewer people invest deeply, social capital declines. Social capital is not easily replaced. It is built through repeated interaction and mutual trust. Rules cannot generate social capital. Only relationships can. Another narrative worth examining is the portrayal of withdrawal as failure. Men who step back are often framed as unable to cope or unwilling to grow. This framing misunderstands motivation. Many men disengage precisely because they have grown. They recognize patterns, they set boundaries, they choose peace over performance. This is not immaturity, it is prioritization. The refusal to acknowledge this prevents meaningful dialogue. Instead of asking what conditions encourage healthy engagement, the focus remains on coercing participation. Coercion rarely produces lasting commitment. Another aspect is how moral certainty has replaced curiosity. When people believe they already understand others' motivations, They stop listening. This hardens divisions. Men who feel misunderstood stop explaining themselves. Explanation becomes exhausting when it is dismissed. Silence becomes simpler. This simplicity is appealing in complex environments. Another narrative shaping behavior is the idea that institutions can substitute for interpersonal skill. That rules can replace communication. That enforcement can replace understanding. This belief is attractive because it promises control. But control does not produce connection. When people rely on systems to manage relationships, they stop developing relational skills. This skill loss compounds over generations. Young people grow up with fewer models of healthy disagreement. They struggle to navigate differences, they default to avoidance or escalation. Neither produces stability. Another media driven dynamic is the constant emphasis on extremes. Stories that go viral are rarely representative. They are selected for emotional impact. But policies influenced by extremes do not serve the majority. Men watching these narratives conclude that they are being judged by outliers. They respond by disengaging from spaces where nuance is absent. This reduces diversity of experience in public discourse. And another issue is how language itself is moralized. Words become symbols. Intent is assumed based on phrasing rather than meaning. This creates a minefield for communication. Men who value precision and clarity find this especially frustrating. They prefer systems with defined rules. When language rules shift constantly, they disengage. This is not because they cannot adapt, it is because adaptation feels endless. Another overlooked narrative is the romanticization of independence without acknowledging interdependence. People are encouraged to be self sufficient, yet expect others to provide support. This contradiction creates resentment. Men who have become self sufficient are less inclined to re enter systems that appear one sided. This self sufficiency is often mistaken for detachment. In reality, it is stability. Stability is hard won and not easily surrendered. Another factor is how institutions often speak in abstract terms rather than lived experience. Policies are justified with theory rather than observation. People living the reality feel unseen. Men who feel unseen stop participating. This withdrawal reduces feedback loops. Policies become even more detached from reality. The gap widens. This is how well intentioned systems drift into dysfunction. The solution is not to abandon moral concern, it is to integrate it with practical wisdom. Stories matter. The stories people hear about themselves shape their choices. If men are told they are liabilities, they will minimize their presence. If women are told institutions will solve relational problems, disappointment will follow. If institutions are told control equals safety, trust will erode. Changing outcomes requires changing stories. Stories that emphasize mutual responsibility. Stories that allow for imperfection. Stories that value dialogue over dominance. So far, those stories are rare. We need equal accountability instead of selective enforcement, dialogue instead of discipline, respect instead of suspicion. These are not radical ideas, they are foundational, but they require humility. Humility from institutions willing to admit unintended consequences. Humility from media willing to tell complex stories. Humility from individuals willing to listen rather than label. Until then, disengagement will continue. Men will continue to walk away quietly, not out of anger, out of clarity. They will build lives that make sense to them, lives that minimize friction, lives that prioritize peace. And they will not announce their departure. They will simply stop showing up. As this happens, society will be forced to confront a simple truth. Participation is a privilege earned through trust, not a resource extracted through pressure. If participation is demanded rather than invited, absence is the natural result. This is where we are now, a crossroads between doubling down on control or rediscovering cooperation. between managing behavior or rebuilding trust, between talking at people or listening to them. The direction chosen will shape the next generation. For those watching this, the question is not which side you are on, but what kind of society you want to live in. One built on fear of missteps, or one built on the ability to repair them. One where silence is safety, or one where dialogue is possible. Leave a comment and tell me what you think about what we discussed today. Do you agree with this direction or do you see it differently? Share your thoughts because these conversations matter more than ever. And like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.